You might not believe it, but every place that once echoed with the laughter of children can hide secrets darker than we imagine. This playground used to be filled with joyful voices, the sound of small feet running across the sand, and excited cheers as swings were pushed high into the air. But now, only silence remains. Or is it really just silence? Or is there something else waiting to be discovered? The playground on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for years. Wild grass grew tall, almost engulfing the swings that now creaked softly whenever the wind blew. Rusty seesaws still stood, but no children shouted joyfully anymore. No one wanted to come here after the tragic accident. The accident that killed a little girl, Tanya. She had been a cheerful child, always coming to this playground with her friends. But one night, Tanya was found dead beneath her favorite swing, her face pale, her eyes wide open as if staring at something only she could see. Since then, they said the playground was haunted, and no child dared to play there anymore. Tonight, for some reason, my friends and I felt challenged. We wanted to prove that the story about the playground ghost was just a myth. We brought flashlights and boldly came here, even though the atmosphere itself already gave us chills. When we arrived, the swings creaked softly, and the air felt colder than usual. Without wind, the swing still moved, as if someone invisible was sitting on it. We exchanged glances, trying to convince ourselves that this was just our imagination. "We'll just stay here for a bit, then leave," said Rena, usually the bravest. But tonight, fear was clear in her eyes. We started exploring. At the edge of the playground, we found an old doll, half buried in the sand. The doll was worn out, with one missing eye. But the strangest thing was its position. It looked as if the doll was watching us. Not long after finding the doll, things started to feel weirder. The swing's creaking grew louder, even though there was no wind. We tried to move away from the swing, but the creaking seemed to follow us. And then, we saw it, a faint shadow on the swing, sitting alone, staring in our direction. "Who is that?" Bogus asked, his voice trembling. No one answered. We all knew there was no one else in the playground, yet the shadow was clearly there. Tanya. Impossible. But the village stories kept replaying in our minds. Many said her spirit still lingered here, waiting for someone to play with her once again. Suddenly, Baga's flashlight flickered and went out. We panicked and tried to turn it back on, but it was useless. In the darkness, we heard a small giggle, a child's giggle. And it wasn't from any of us. "Quick, get out of here," Rena shouted, her voice shaking. But before we could move, the giggle turned into a soft whisper. "Let's play. Let's play." Panicking, we ran toward the seesaws, hoping to escape the playground as quickly as possible. However, when we reached the gate, it was locked tightly. Impossible. We had just entered, and the gate had never been locked before. "Someone locked us in," Bogus shouted, his voice full of fear. At that moment, I looked toward the seesaw and was horrified by what I saw. There was a small figure sitting at the end of the seesaw, wearing a dirty white dress, her hair hanging over part of her face. It was Tanya. It had to be her. "Come on, play with me," Her voice was soft but clear. We stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Rena started crying out of fear, and I could feel cold sweat dripping down my back. There was no way out. We were trapped in this cursed playground with a spirit demanding playmates. The figure slowly rose from the seesaw and started walking toward us. Each of her steps echoed, though her feet seemed to float above the ground. We stepped back, trying to keep our distance, but the playground felt like it was shrinking. "Run," I whispered to my friends. But every time we tried to move, it was as if some invisible force held us back. Tanya grew closer, and when she was just a few steps away, I could see her face clearly. Her once bright eyes were now hollow, black, like bottomless pits. She lifted her hand and touched the swing, the same swing where she had last sat before she died. "Let's play," she repeated, this time with a deeper voice, almost like a whisper from the darkness itself. We had no choice. Something about her voice made me feel that if we refused, something much worse would happen. Night grew darker, and the game had turned into something far more sinister. Would we survive this playground? Or were we destined to become part of an endless game? We stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of Tanya's empty gaze. The swing creaked louder, forcing us to hear it. But what was most terrifying was the smile slowly creeping onto her face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a promise, a threat that none of us could escape. "We have to play," Rena's voice trembled, barely audible. She couldn't hold back her tears any longer, but I knew she was right. We wouldn't get out of this playground unless we obeyed. But what game did she want? The swing moved by itself, as if pushed by invisible hands. I didn't know what to do, and the fear surrounding us deepened. Tanya stood still, watching us expectantly, but her expectation wasn't for a normal game. There was something darker, more sinister behind that gaze. "We have to end this," Bogus tried to sound brave, though I knew he was just as scared. "If we play along, maybe we'll be free." Finally, we reluctantly approached the swings, every step weighed down by dread. When I sat on the swing, the cold immediately wrapped around my body. Tanya watched us from a distance, smiling. "Swing for me," she whispered. Slowly, Bogus began to push my swing. Nothing happened for a while, but then, a sharp cold wind began to swirl around us. The air grew heavy, hard to breathe, and suddenly the swing moved faster, more wildly, even though Bogus had stopped pushing. I screamed, trying to stop the swing, but I couldn't. Something unseen had taken control of the game. We didn't know what to do anymore. The swing, moving on its own, filled us with terror, but worse was Tanya drawing closer. Her smile twisted into a sinister grin, and her pale, cold hand began pointing toward the seesaw. "Now it's your turn there," she said, her voice full of madness. We had no choice but to obey. Slowly we moved toward the seesaw, a sense of dread clouding every step. Once we sat on it, strange sensations overwhelmed us. Every time one of us went up, we felt something pulling us down, like invisible hands dragging us into the ground. Then, something appeared beneath the seesaw. A small, pale, cold hand gripping the end. Or at least, part of her that shouldn't exist in this world anymore. I want to play forever. Her voice sounded distorted now. We were terrified but couldn't stop. Every time we tried to escape, the game pulled us back. Like a trap that had been set long ago. We were already in too deep. The game demanded more of our souls. We kept playing, but Tanya's presence grew stronger. She now sat in the middle of the playground, watching us with an eerie anticipation, her smile widening and her eyes growing darker. We knew that if this continued, we might never leave. "There's another way," Rena whispered suddenly, as if struck by a sudden realization. "We have to stop her, the way she died." I turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" "We have to finish what she started. She died on the swing, right? If we stop the swing in her way, maybe we can be free." The idea sounded crazy, but at that point, anything that could offer an escape was worth trying. With fear tightening around us, we returned to the swing. This was the place where Tanya had died, and we knew if there was a way to end the curse, it had to be done here. Slowly, we approached the swing that still creaked quietly, and something inside me screamed not to do it. But we had no other choice. I sat on the swing, my heart pounding. Bogus and Rena stood nearby, waiting for whatever was about to happen. "Let's finish this," I said with a shaky voice. The swing began to move by itself again, but this time, I felt heavier, as if something was pulling me down. In the stillness of the night, Tanya's laughter echoed again, but this time closer, more real. Suddenly, I felt myself falling. Not from the swing, but as if I were being dragged down into the ground itself. The others screamed my name, but their voices faded as everything around me turned dark. I woke up, still on the playground, but it wasn't the same. Everything was warped, twisted, and silent. I was alone, and the playground around me looked like a place forgotten by time. "Tanya," I called out, but there was no response. Had we finally ended the game? Or was this just the beginning of a new nightmare? I stood up, looking for a way out, but the gate that was once locked was now open. I could leave, but something told me that not all of us were free. Something had been left behind in that cursed playground, a part of us trapped in Tanya's endless game. The playground now stands empty again, but I know the truth. It's not just abandoned, it's waiting. Waiting for someone else to enter and play. A game that never truly ends.